Hey, what's up? Hello, my name is Emma, and today for Mental Illness Awareness Week, we are going to be talking about anxiety disorders. Now, when a lot of people hear the word anxiety, they might think of one of two things. Number one being the general type of anxiety all humans experience. At some point or another, we are all going to get anxious in our lives, we're going to get nervous and overwhelmed, and that is a normal part of our experience. Or else if they are thinking of actual mental illnesses, they might think of only one type of anxiety, when in reality there are over 17 different anxiety disorders that we're going to be discussing today. Now, the actual word anxiety means a perceived fear, threat, or dread, so that is a theme that you're probably going to be able to identify in almost all of the disorders we're going to be talking about because that's what really groups them together. I also need to place a disclaimer that this video should not be used for self-diagnosis purposes. Number one, I am not a psychologist. You would need to go to an actual psychologist in order to be diagnosed with one of these mental illnesses. And number two, this is such a brief overview that it cannot possibly account for all of the complexities and different individual experiences with people who actually suffer from these disorders. This is just meant to be an educational video. And as such, if you are somebody who does suffer from an anxiety disorder and you're like, hey, what you said isn't true about my disorder, that's absolutely possible. I am in no way saying that the specific criteria and symptoms I'm talking about in this video are true for everyone. Now, there are three different categories we're going to be talking about today: anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and trauma and stress-related disorders. The first of the anxiety disorders that we're going to be talking about is separation anxiety disorder, which is mostly diagnosed in children, but it can absolutely exist in adults as well. Separation anxiety disorder is characterized by excessive feelings of distress when away from family or familiar locations, and it has to be inappropriate for that person's developmental age. I think we can all agree that it's definitely reasonable for a 2-year-old to be very anxious when leaving family members, but it might not be as appropriate for a 12-year-old. For a child to be diagnosed, this behavior has to last longer than 4 weeks, and for adults it has to be 6 months. A good way to explain why is most children, when going to school or camp for the first time, the first few days, the first week, they'll cry, they'll scream, they won't want to leave their parents, but they do eventually adjust and fit well into that environment. Children with separation anxiety disorder won't experience that adjustment, and they will continue to cry and feel uncomfortable in new situations without attachment figures for months sometimes. Next is selective mutism, which again is mostly diagnosed in children, but it can absolutely be present in adult lives as well. This is characterized by the failure to speak in situations where speech is normally expected, but not in others. So, for example, somebody might not talk at school, or they might not talk in public, but they might talk all the time at home, and this behavior has to last for more than 1 month. I think it's sometimes easier to explain what a mental illness is not, because there's so many times when we refer to basic behaviors as an actual mental illness. So selective mutism is not general shyness, it is not failure to speak related to a different communication disorder like stuttering, and it's also not present in children who are immigrants who are moving to a new country for the first time where the language or the environment is unfamiliar to them. Next is specific phobia, which is an intense and irrational fear of certain things or situations that is lasting longer than 6 months. Now, as humans, we are all scared of things. We all have fears. We all have biggest fears, and a specific phobia is not necessarily one's biggest fear. Specific phobia involves severe anxiety as a result of sometimes even just the thought of what they are afraid of, let alone actually encountering it, so it is much more debilitating than the things we are just conventionally afraid of. More than 1 in 10 people have specific phobia, and it absolutely impacts everyone differently, which is a huge misconception. A lot of people think when you have a specific phobia, like you have to be completely avoidant of everything related to that phobia, when in reality it can sometimes be very specific to certain situations. For example, let's say your specific phobia is of heights. You might be totally content and calm on an airplane, but when it comes to Ferris wheels, you might have severe panic attacks at just the thought of going on one. A big misconception is that you have to be afraid of every single aspect related to that phobia, when in reality it differs just the way so many other things do in our lives. Next, we have a social phobia, otherwise known as social anxiety, which is definitely one of the biggest disorders that gets overused in just the general public. Things like being uncomfortable in large crowds, in front of people you don't know, or talking on the phone may be symptoms of one's social anxiety, but it does not necessarily mean that you have an official social phobia. I definitely have a lot of anxieties very specific to interacting with other people, but I am totally aware that I don't actually have social anxiety. I have anxiety in social situations. situations, not the mental illness. What makes social anxiety so specific is it is based in the fear of judgment or embarrassment in front of others. Like many mental illnesses, social anxiety is extremely intrusive. People with this illness may avoid talking, eating, even writing in public places for fear of drawing attention to their mistakes. It seriously impacts social functioning. So social anxiety is not just being an introvert. It's not just not wanting to go to parties because you don't know people there. Again, those can absolutely be parts of social anxiety, but they aren't sole indicators. Next, we have panic disorder, which is characterized by recurring panic attacks of intense terror that appear unexpectedly. Panic attacks are definitely misused by the public. They are extremely serious things to experience. When one is experiencing a panic attack, they may feel like they're losing their mind, they might feel like they're having an actual heart attack, or they might feel like they're on the verge of death. Typically, they only last about 10 minutes, but they can be shorter or longer dependent on the person. But although that seems like a very short period of time, it can be terrifying to experience. Now, you can definitely experience panic attacks without having an official panic disorder. The panic disorder is really dependent on the recurrence and like multiple panic disorders occurring in a certain period of time, as well as avoiding particular places where panic attacks have occurred. When you have panic disorder, you can't predict when the next panic attack is going to happen, so it can seriously impact your functioning, and a lot of your decisions can be based on that fear of not knowing when the next panic attack is going to occur. Next, we have agoraphobia, which is characterized by the avoidance of certain situations where a person fears they might not have an escape in a moment of perceived danger, and it has to last for longer than 6 months. A lot of people with agoraphobia don't even go outside of their house, let alone to certain situations, because they are afraid that if something bad happens, they will be trapped. According to the DSM-5, you must experience intense fear in at least 2 of the 5 following situations, which are using public transportation, being in open spaces, being in closed spaces, standing in a line and being in a crowd, or else being outside of the home alone. The way that agoraphobia differs from other anxiety disorders that involve avoidance is because it's based on the fear of an escape, whereas something like social anxiety, you avoid certain situations for fear of embarrassment. And the final disorder characterized as an anxiety disorder is generalized anxiety disorder. This is what most people generally refer to as just anxiety, as it is the most common mental illness in the United States. It is characterized by the chronic exaggeration and worry that is not necessarily provoked by a specific event, and it has to last for longer than 6 months. So essentially, you worry about literally everything. A lot of times, generalized anxiety disorder isn't looked at as a real mental illness because a lot of people with GAD are able to function in daily life, whereas for something like agoraphobia, you're prevented from leaving your house. But the constant worry and the fears that are constantly plaguing people can make it an absolutely debilitating disorder to suffer from. Next, we're moving into obsessive-compulsive disorders. I bet y'all thought there was only one OCD, and you would in fact be wrong. There are quite a few. First is obviously what we come to know as obsessive-compulsive disorder. OCD involves recurring intrusive thoughts and ritualistic behaviors to sort of alleviate the anxiety caused by those thoughts. There is a sort of subset of OCD that is often referred to as pure O, which involves the obsessive thoughts without the compulsive behaviors. For a lot of people, OCD is rooted in the thought that there will be a consequence if they don't perform a specific behavior. So for example, somebody might think, I have to wash my hands 13 times a day, otherwise I will get sick and die, or I will get somebody else sick and they will die. And as it is something that they might constantly think about, they're going to continue washing their hands so that none of those consequences happen. A big misconception is that all people with OCD are obsessed with neatness and cleanliness, which is not true at all. The thoughts and compulsions can be related to absolutely anything. For example, my sister was diagnosed with OCD when she was a child, and a lot of her compulsions revolved around things like not being able to enter a room without jumping in and out of the room 3 times, or turning the lights on and off before entering or leaving a room. Even now, my sister might not make her bed in the morning and she can leave her clothes unfolded, but she will not leave the house unless she has checked that all of the dials on her gas stove are turned off, or that she has triple checked that the door is locked. So it manifests differently for absolutely everyone. Next is body dysmorphic disorder, which is characterized by the preoccupation with a flaw on oneself, whether it be real or imagined. So it might be something that is present, like a birthmark or a facial deformity, or else it could be something that none of us could see, but you are absolutely confident that it is there, and it is followed by a lot of ritualistic behaviors according to that flaw. That preoccupation must cause significant distress and impairment in functioning in social, occupational, or other situations, and the preoccupation must be completely independent from another mental illness. So So for example, a lot of people think that those with anorexia or similar eating disorders always have body dysmorphic disorder because they have a distorted self-image. And while there is definitely research to support an overlap between the two, one does not predict the other and they can exist completely independently. Next is hoarding disorder, and yes, this is an actual diagnosable mental illness and it is characterized by the irrational difficulty in discarding items regardless of their value. Usually people with hoarding disorder can explain away their difficulties in throwing out items because they have a justification for it, like they might feel like they're saving money, they might attach sentimental value to absolutely everything, or fear that they may need it in the future. Hoarding disorder also has to create an intense amount of distress and impairment in functioning, like the home conditions we all see on shows like Hoarders, where families sometimes can't even live with an individual that they previously lived with because their house has just become so full of stuff because they cannot throw anything out. Next we have trichotillomania, which is sometimes referred to as trich, and it is compulsive hair pulling. A big part of trichotillomania is the repeated attempts to stop hair pulling, because people who suffer from this sort of condition, they know what they're doing is wrong and they know it's not a healthy way to cope with stress, but because of their mental illness, they're unable to stop doing so. And also a lot of people with trich have a personal preference as to where they do their hair pulling. So for some it might be out of the scalp, it might be on their arms or legs, it could be their eyebrows, their eyelashes, or even their pubic hair. And similarly, we have dermatillomania, which is sometimes referred to as like excoriation. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it is compulsive skin picking. It is very, very similar to trichotillomania, except for the fact that it is compulsive skin picking that often leaves skin lesions as opposed to balding spots. And finally, we are heading on over to trauma and stress related disorders. Firstly, we have reactive attachment disorder, which is diagnosed in children who exhibit an underdeveloped level of attachment for their age level as a result of inadequate nurturing, and it has to occur after 9 months of age. Some behaviors related to this illness might be a child doesn't reach out or rely on their caregivers, they aren't very interactive, and in the case that a caregiver does express comfort to the child and maybe gives them a hug, the child will often be very confused because they don't recognize that this is a form of affection and they won't hug the parent back. Next we have disinhibited social engagement disorder, which is diagnosed in children who display an inappropriate familiarity with strangers within a cultural context, and that also has to occur after 9 months of age. Now there's definitely some criteria I have left out of a lot of these disorders because it's pretty much the same for any mental illness and it's very repetitive, but I say within a cultural context because for disinhibited social engagement disorder, there are definitely cultures where interacting with strangers is common or encouraged. In the US, I think it's pretty unanimous that we don't want our children interacting with people we and they don't know. So children with disinhibited social engagement disorder have to display two of the following. They have to display either reduced interest in interacting with attachment figures, overly familiar physical and verbal behavior with strangers, lack of checking in with attachment figures, which essentially means, like most kids who go to a park with their family, they will say things like, "Mommy, watch me go down the slide," and they want to know that their family is watching them. Children with DSED don't do that, or else a willingness to go off and venture off with strangers. Again, it's usually a result of lack of a comfortable or stable attachment in early childhood. Next is post-traumatic stress disorder, which I feel a lot of people know about, but there are 5 clusters of symptoms I'm going to go through very quickly. Cluster A includes an actual or threatened traumatic event. So that can either be experienced directly, it can be witnessed, it can be experienced indirectly, which means like through somebody else and hearing about it, or else extreme indirect exposure, which is usually from the media. So these can be things that we personally experience, like being caught in a fire or a victim of an assault, or else it can be things like watching a natural disaster occur on TV or hearing about somebody going through something that is close to you. Cluster B is deemed intrusion or re-experiencing, and this really involves the intrusive thoughts, memories, nightmares, or flashbacks of the trauma. Cluster C is avoidance, and that involves avoiding thoughts, feelings, or people or situations that are related to the event. Cluster D refers to changes in mood and cognition. So this can involve things like memory loss, feelings of blame or guilt related to the event, or feeling isolated or distanced from others. And cluster E is increased arousal. So this involves things like being easily startled, irritability, sleep problems, or hypervigilance. There are subtypes of PTSD that are related to specifically depersonalization and derealization or dissociation, and at least one of each cluster has to be present for at least a month with impaired functioning in different situations to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Next, we have acute stress disorder, which is very closely related to post-traumatic stress disorder, except for two elements. So number one, you only have to experience symptoms from 3 of the 5 clusters as opposed to all 5 of PTSD, and it is present for a shorter period of time. So it has to be persistent for longer than 3 days, but less than 1 month. If it persists for more than 1 month and you have all 5 of those symptoms, then it would be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. So acute stress disorder can be diagnosed before PTSD, or it can be completely independent from PTSD if those symptoms aren't existing for longer than 4 weeks. And finally, we get to adjustment disorder, which is sometimes known as stress response syndrome. So adjustment disorder is characterized by difficulty in adjusting to a new stressor, whether it be positive or negative, in a way that is more intense than normal. Now, when we think of the word stress, we normally think of negative situations like losing your job or losing a friend or losing a pet. But we can also experience positive stressors, which are things that are conventionally recognized as good things that happen in our life, but they do change a lot in relation to stress. So an example of that might be marriage, or having a child, or buying a home for the first time. Now, absolutely all of us experience stress. We all get very nervous and anxious when things are changing in our life, but adjustment disorder is very specific, as it is focused on the difficulty in adjusting to that stressor, and it has to last for longer than 6 months. It has to really involve severe impairment in functioning. So for example, for those of us who start college for the first time, we might spend that first month feeling a little down, feeling a little out of place, feeling overwhelmed, adjusting to work, but it has to last longer for 6 months, and it has to be more adjustment difficulties than normal. I feel like a good example of this is having a child for the first time, because most parents do experience stress when having their first baby. It happens to everyone. New parents always complain about having trouble sleeping with their baby, being overwhelmed or extra irritable. So for somebody with adjustment disorder that just had their first child, it's gonna go beyond the typical like sleeping problems. So maybe it starts with that, but then they have a loss of appetite, maybe they stop showing up for work, maybe they stop engaging with the child for a year, whereas a lot of other parents might get used to it in the first handful of months. So that is really it for my video on anxiety disorders. I hope you guys enjoyed this brief overview of the many different types of anxiety disorders a lot of people experience. I hope you guys learned something. Definitely let me know in the comments below if you retained any new information from this video, or maybe if you have any experience of your own related to anxiety disorders that you want to share with me, because I would love to hear them. But that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for another video for Mental Illness Awareness Week. Bye!